Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And this is a very exciting event and an amazing setting. I'm very pleased to be talking to you here. Personhood refers to the state of being a person, much as childhood refers to the state of being a child. Personhood is relational, since persons are generated by relationships among other persons and with other persons. And persons come into being and they undergo a process of living and dying. Each person changes repeatedly throughout life, including through dramatic events such as rites of passage. Each person is also deconstituted and reconfigured after biological death. Again, rites of passage feature heavily in this process. This? Okay. Okay, so exactly how personhood is constituted and deconstituted varies culturally, but there are also important commonalities. For instance, persons are generally considered to consist of different aspects, such as a mind, body, and soul. And different materials or features of the body will have distinct properties. After death, certain past relationships may be commemorated and extended using such material media, while others are forgotten, and aspects of the person can be absorbed into the world and into the community. In this talk, what I want to do is to discuss some anthropological examples of these kinds of processes before discussing some proto-historic and prehistoric studies of the extension and transformation of personhood after death. Now, in much of the Anglophone literature on personhood, there lies a view that modern Western persons experience death as a single moment, an abrupt and clear end to the person. The idea is that this corresponds to a boundedness, an indivisibility of the person, which is commonly brought to the fore. Oh dear.
C'è la possibilità di fare qualcosa, sì, ingrandire un po'.
It's fine on my screen. All right, I'll push on. It's live behind though.
Scusate, non è quello che ha sul computer quello che in questo momento sta apparendo.
It's not on there, it's this one. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You have to watch.
Okay. Where are we? Okay, yes, all right. So the idea is that in the West, there's a bounded, indivisible person, and this is brought to the fore in daily life and narratives about individuality. This is often contrasted in the same literature with studies of non-Western societies in which death is identified as part of a gradual and multi-phase process of life, death, and ancestry, in which differing features of a complex and composite person are manipulated. An example might be Bloch's classic studies of the mariner in Madagascar. Here, the soft fluid body of infancy and youth dries out through life and death. The corpse is buried for several years after death, and when desiccated, is exhumed and moved to an ancestral tomb. The more individualistic characteristics of the person are associated with soft, fleshy elements of the body that pass down the female line, while the most enduring relations are associated with the bones, eventually installed in the stone tomb of the male ancestral line. Over time, the bones are themselves disintegrated, including when they're brought out of the tomb in ceremonies when new remains, new ancestors are added. Now, by contrast, the communal tomb itself endures. Now, on one level, this contrast between Western indivisible and individualized persons and non-Western divisible or dividual persons can be useful in illustrating diversity in personhood and differing beliefs about who or what the body and the person belong to. However, as Bloch himself noted, this division is too neat and generalizing. And personhood in the West is also a relational process, even when explained as the achievement of an individual. And following this, I prefer an approach that explores the detail of how personhood is composed and decomposed in each context, considering how mortuary practices might divide a person into different components or elements, and alter connections between persons living and dead. It's also important to consider diversity within each context and how this relates to the general process of becoming a person and beliefs about death. For instance, children under 5 years old are not admitted to Mariner tombs, and those who are buried will only be exhumed and placed in a tomb if they've been good kin and assisted in tomb upkeep. Personhood and access to ancestry are variable then, and often depend on how well the dead affirm a dominant cultural ethos. I want to consider a few examples that illustrate varied treatments of the body and uses of material media in mortuary practices, and yet highlight features of an underlying ethos on personhood in that context. I'll start with Daniel de Coppi's analysis of the 20th century RARA community of the Solomon Islands, a horticultural society in which the living are indebted to the efforts of their ancestors. In life, persons are composed of body, breath, and at least for adults, image, all of which ultimately emanate from the ancestors. Funerary practices must deal not only with the body, but also sometimes the image and the breath. The bodies of people who are murdered are left in the forest. If the murder was avenged by another death, the breath dissipates, but if not, it becomes a hostile spirit. Women dying in childbirth, infants under 40 days old, and suicides are treated in a similar way. By contrast, the bodies of those who die in other ways are buried, exposed, cremated, or sunk at sea. But importantly, these varied treatments of the corpse are nonetheless taken to have a similar effect because of the role of other media in funerary ceremonies, and I'll come to that in a moment. The breath again dissipates. If the deceased did not achieve any of the key features expected of adulthood, and that acts that sustain the community, such as marriage, then their image will fade soon after death, and they will receive only a simple funeral. If the deceased has achieved things expected of adults, they will undergo 3 successive funerary events. A simple one, a few days after death, and 2 more elaborate ceremonies in coming years. Now, importantly, body, breath, and image are not only contained within the fabric of the human body, but are invested in material things, particularly crops, pigs, and shell goods. Each person is formed through the circulation of these things in their lifetime. At the complex secondary funerals, aspects of the deceased are commemorated in piles of vegetables conveying body, pork conveying body and breath, and shell money conveying image. The funerary ritual temporarily brings the distributed person together in one locale before dispersing these components amongst the mourners who eat them or take them away as gifts. Okay, the shell goods in particular are invested with ancestral image, which is drawn out at other funerary ceremonies and will be circulated in other exchange occasions, such as marriages. Yet each funerary ceremony draws in shells that were associated with people who died previously and combines these together in the name of the recently deceased. In time, that person's ancestor image will in turn be absorbed into future ancestor images of other people in a renewing chain of ancestry. This funerary process converts the deceased from a being with body, breath, and image to an ancestor consisting only of image. Unless the deceased was cremated, their skull, also encapsulating image, can be recovered from the decaying corpse and lodged in a special structure in the forest where the ancestors are venerated. But generally, other media do the work of commemoration and personal transformation. The media of the image are hard, enduring, luminous materials, which enchain multiple persons and multiple ancestors. Now, in this case, aspects of the composite person are invested in material things as well as the human body, and death marks a shift in personal composition. The partability of the person is clear in this case, but there are multiple norms for funerary treatment because various fates are possible, depending on factors such as the means of death and the achievement of certain relationships during life. Funerary activity deconstitutes the person, and how much work has to be done depends on how the living perceive the relationships constituting that person before death. The resulting variation in how the remains of the dead are treated does not accord to a simple notion of hierarchy, for instance, although it does relate to the fulfillment of activities that please the ancestors. While the name of a person successfully achieving ancestral image is commemorated for years, that eventually ceases, and the person is not commemorated through any material media that individualize the image of the dead. Now, the situation in contemporary Britain may seem very different, yet there are some similarities, and I want to highlight these to underline that personhood is relational in any context. The person may be generally understood to be contained within the skin, but actually a wide range of media are vital in commemorating and transforming the dead beyond the funeral, including photographic images, objects intimate to the deceased, and monuments marked with their name, such as benches dedicated in public parks. Increasingly, funerals are personalised to convey the relationships key to that person in life and to recount memories of experiences that they shared with the dead. Recently, the rise in cremation has been adapted into new practices for curating the remains of the dead and extending relations with them, including dividing up the cremated remains between different kin members and wearing jewellery containing cremated remains. We also see tattoos in ink made from cremated remains. I want to look at one example. In 2013, Englishman William Mullane Jr. had a photograph of his father's face tattooed on his arm using ink containing his father's cremated remains. And note that the father and son already shared the same name. The face of William Mullane Sr. was depicted realistically and drawn from a photograph. Both his individual image and his kinship with his son are materialised in a new way. This practice is clearly unusual for the time, and hence it is also highly individualistic. But a key point here is that individualising personhood is relational too. In contemporary Britain, many of the key relations individualise. But at the same time, kinship, friendships, and other relations are fundamental to that individualisation and to the process of commemoration after death. The boundaries of the body may not be so rigid and impermeable as we may imagine, and the living may retain emotional relations with the dead through a wide variety of different media. Now, at this point, I want to outline an archaeological study that I think neatly captures how archaeologists can, in some cases, understand the relational composition of the person and trace multiple ways that a person is transformed after death. Emma Jane Graham has studied the death, funeral, and particularly post-funerary activities associated with the Roman senator Marcus Nonius Balbus. Balbus was a key public figure for Herculaneum during his life in the 1st century BC. For instance, he funded the construction of key public buildings. Balbus was given a special funeral rite, os resectum, in which a finger was removed before the rest of his body was cremated, and after the cremation, that finger bone was buried at a newly commissioned altar. After he died, the town repaid his generosity in life then. They perpetuated and proliferated Balbus's name and image, and even his body. There are at least 10 public statues of him. There was an annual festival that bore his name, and a seat at the theatre was kept free for him. In years following his death, the community participated in processions around the town, visiting the altar and some of the statues dedicated to him. So, Balbus was distributed through the community, and this was made visible and enduring after his death. His body was divided up through the funerary rite, and his face and body were proliferated through statuary. His body may well have been idealised in the statuary in a way that partly illustrated his transcendence to the state of being a revered ancestor. His person was perpetuated through this imagery and through engraving his composite 3-word name, which is also a statement of his kinship. Now, these different funerary and post-funerary acts transformed Balbus in varying and multiple ways, extending certain features of his person beyond biological death. Now, if we compare and contrast the three examples I've mentioned so far, Balbus became inalienable from the city after his death, just as William Mullane is inseparable from his father, and Merina and RA communities are inalienable from their ancestors. The dead, including ancestors, are relational persons too, and not all relationships with them revolve around their bodily remains. Now, to my mind, Graham's piece is an excellent study of the relationships that comprised Balbus, his relations with the city in which he lived, and how these were transformed after death. It illustrates the extent to which funerary and commemorative practices redistribute aspects of the person spatially and extend them through time. But this is a period in which names and personal images were invested in enduring media, like stone, through epigraphy, through statuary, at least for those able to obtain privileged positions in life and death, and there's a lot more we could say about the treatment of special persons I'll leave aside. But I work on the British Neolithic and Early Bronze Age, and here the situation is rather different. This difference is not simply a matter of what has been lost in the passage of time, but is also due to differences in the media, relations, and concerns of the day. Histories were oral, not written. The faces of the dead were not rendered in ways that recorded their individuality in enduring media. As far as we know, the faces of the living and the dead were not represented very often at all. The dead were transformed and commemorated in other and varied ways, and I would suggest that these prioritized key relationships fundamental to personhood at that given time. The challenge is to identify these transformations and the role that different material media had in them. What were the matters of concern? The British early Neolithic exhibits a considerable range of mortuary practices and architecture between around 3,900 and 3,500 BC. Perhaps the most famous are chambered tombs. Now, since stone chambers can potentially be accessed repeatedly over millennia, it can be difficult to determine how much the remains have been affected by later disturbance and other taphonomic issues. However, some diversity in treatment is evident. The proportions of men, women, and children vary, but usually all are present to some extent. In many cases, the dead were probably placed intact in the tomb, and their remains only fragmented and commingled later. In other cases, gnaw marks from scavengers or cut marks from flint tools suggest that the remains were exposed for some time before entombment or were processed after death. There are also cases of cremation, particularly common in Ireland. The funerary sites housed the dead collectively and were themselves often repeatedly transformed. If you look at the bottom left image there, that tomb, there were two earlier tombs. The one you see at the front there is a later addition. There's a multi-phase site. Now, chambers were made in wood as well as in stone, bottom right, and many wooden chambers were burnt down. After this dramatic act, an earthen mound was built over the site. But there are other contemporary practices in regions overlapping with or neighbouring those where chambers were built. Mortuary deposits at 2 Long Barrows in Lincolnshire, Giants Hills, provide an example. At Giants Hills 1, a platform of chalk slabs was laid out to the rear of a curved facade of split tree trunks. Oh, you can't see that. Okay. A long barrow was built around this platform, but leaving it exposed. The remains of 8 people were placed on this platform, and the void was backfilled with chalk rubble. 4 of the dead were laid in a crouched position, but another 4 were fragmentary, with heavily weathered bones. At Giants Hills 2, 2 adult crania and fragments of 13 long bones from 3 people were placed between 2 decaying split wooden posts, split tree trunks, and covered with a low chalk mound. One humerus exhibited cut marks, and some bones were gnawed by scavengers. All were weathered. So this is a tertiary deposit. This is remains that have been collected from elsewhere. They've already been transformed, and they're deposited here, and then the monument is constructed. A barrow was then built over the top. At both sites, a monument was constructed to cover a collective act of burial. Death was transmuted into growth in these small-scale agricultural communities. Now, these acts do not seem to relate to the funeral of a single individual, but a coming together of the dead that was then commemorated. We might consider burials like these as establishing a new status for a lineage or a clan at a pre-existing shrine made out of these now decaying posts. If we looked at other kinds of contemporary sites, such as causewayed enclosures, we would see, many different transformations of the dead. For instance, at Hambledon Hill, skulls of men, women, and children seem to have been curated, displayed, and then deposited, although it is hard to say whether these were trophies of head-taking or other violence, objects of ancestral veneration, or shifted between those categories. There's a general concern, though, with curating body parts. Across the south of England, including at Hambledon Hill, there are also unusual cases of burial in shallow graves, often carefully covered with chalk or flint, and sometimes marked by a wooden post. These are sometimes accompanied by chalk objects or fossils, as in the two examples here. And they're often within or near the outside ditch of these enclosure sites. Now, overall, there's diversity in how and where the body was transformed. I should add that these two are both children, and they're both children who had skull deformities. Overall, then, there's a diversity in how and where the body was transformed, whether this took place before or after deposition, and how quickly it was transformed. A key similarity across much of Britain is that artifacts were rarely found with the human remains, and I think we have to consider whether these were retained by the living community, destroyed to sever ties with the dead, or deposited elsewhere, again, distributing the person throughout the community and throughout the landscape. While there probably was a place in early Neolithic funerary processes for a commemoration of individual lives, that probably occurred early in any funeral and does not seem to be the enduring concern of the funerary processes that we see. Instead, the living encountered bodies in parts, as bones, sometimes in the process of decay. And the process of decay and fragmentation often leads into this practice of regrowth of building sites. And these are matters of concern for the living. The relationships between a community and a place come to the fore, and that place contains and embodies the substances of the ancestors. Now, the early Neolithic is often contrasted with the Beaker period or early Bronze Age around 2500 to 1500 BC, because single burial is prevalent in this period, and it's often interpreted as emphasizing an individual and indivisible person. Yet, Joanna Brooke and others have suggested that the artifacts placed in these graves cited relationships between the deceased and those surviving, drawing out relational personhood even when the body was left intact. I would agree with this. I would also point out that the choice of grave goods is very selective, and rarely more than 2 or 3 items are found in one grave, except in the earliest bell beaker burials and late burials in regions like Wessex. I'm interested in the north of Britain, though. It therefore seems unlikely that the range of grave goods were intended to reflect a full-lived biography. There is also considerable change within the period, and I think that can be understood in terms of shifting relations between the living and the dead, and changing concepts of personhood and kinship. So we'll have a look at that, some of that change. Short kist burials, these stone-lined graves that we see in northern Britain, they're used in various ways. If we look at the period between 2300 and 2100 to 2000 BC, they are sometimes contain burials with bronze daggers. Many included beaker pottery or food vessel pottery. A few held buttons or necklaces made from material like jet. They usually only contained one of these objects, sometimes 2. Specific bodily postures and objects were clearly appropriate for people of a certain age or sex. Initially, kists with beaker pottery were carefully aligned east to west, and in many cases, men were buried on their left with their head to the east, and women on their right with their head to the west, as Alexandra Shepherd has identified. She's also identified some differences in the size and shape of the vessels, depending on whether it's a man or a woman. Both object selection and body positioning created idealized images of the dead that varied by sex. Burials of children were rare unless accompanying others. After 2150 BC, child burials became more common, and grave orientations more varied, particularly for burials with food vessel pottery. And in some areas, localized patterns in orientation became important. Pottery continued to predominate in graves. The selectivity of objects in kist burials perhaps conveys features of personhood that were presented as valuable in the funerary context, particularly the ethos of giving and receiving food and drink in pots, and perhaps also the preparation of food and other important acts of cutting using bronze knives. In such ways, the living related to the dead, perhaps repaying past debts and hoping for a return gift. By contrast, we should also think about the things that are missing. Arrowheads were relatively rare, and copper alloy axe heads were almost never buried with the dead. Now, these axe heads were valuable, luminous, enduring objects that seem to have stayed with the community of the living, perhaps being remelted and reused. Perhaps these were present in initial stages of funerary practice and then retained by the living, objects inalienable from the community, connecting the living and the dead, or perhaps they were destroyed and reborn, resmelted as new objects. What we see in these graves is only a stage then, a compression of stages, but a stage in what was probably a complex narrative in personal transformation. And in that narrative, tensions between the person and the community were worked out in different ways. But the dead were presented in the grave in idealized postures and cosmological orientations, with objects referencing very specific activities. Now, these objects contained the idealized dead in a tight stone chamber, which was generally sealed tight and kept free of soil. These earlier kists seem to occur singly or sometimes in pairs. But these were not all single burials, and not all of freshly deceased intact bodies. Here at Dryburn Bridge, 2 kists each contained a crouched burial with remains from a second disarticulated burial, in one case a child with a really bad respiratory disease that affected the facial bones. These were seemingly buried together at the same time. In other cases, kists were reopened, bones were disturbed, a second set of remains added. These containers then partly preserved the remains from the decaying effects of soil. They partly sealed the dead away from the living, and they partly marked a place for later commemoration. You can see the remains of a post in that feature as well that would have marked the grave. And this place could be potentially accessed and disturbed. Now, in some cases, the bones, stones, and also the soil in the pit around the kist were burnt before the grave was sealed. And it's possible there's a multi-stage funerary sequence ending with mound construction. And that construction might end a narrative with the triumph of something new, regeneration, rebirth, growth out of death. Not everybody was buried in this way. As with the early Neolithic, and perhaps the deaths of certain people were particularly traumatic for the community, particularly difficult deaths, and that includes, but is not restricted to, deaths of community leaders. Some deaths might have demanded more work than others. Increasingly, towards 2000 BC, burials became more frequent, however, and the dead also aggregated in small cemeteries. Larger mounds covered several burials, uniting the dead in a single memorial. These round mounds were sporadically reused in later centuries, particularly for burying cremated remains, and cremation predominates after around 2000 BC. The urns containing these cremated remains sometimes combined the bones of several individuals. By this time, the effect of burial had changed, incorporating the deceased into a local community of the dead, some of whom were probably anonymous ancestors by this time. But throughout the period, the permeability, the partibility, and the enchainment of the dead has to be considered by taking account of the things in the graves, the things that are missing from the graves, the degree of commingling of bones, and the relative dispersal and nucleation of the dead. Relationships change, not just between the living and the dead, but among the community of the dead too. Now, I want to end by just summarizing a few key points raised by the anthropological examples and relevant to archaeological studies. Death often involves a process of staged transformation of different aspects of a person, each stage consisting of selective remembering and forgetting. In the process, matters of concern come to the fore, and I think that these are, to some extent, archaeologically detectable, as different pathways of commemoration, transformation, and dissolution. This happens during funerary rites of passage, but it also happens in other ways aside from and after those rituals. Think of the circulation of the shell goods in Melanesia. Think of the way that the memorial tattoos are used to carry on those relationships with the dead long after the funeral has ended. Personhood may vary by gender, by age, and by life stage, or, if relevant, special categories of esteemed or sacred persons. Accordingly, the treatment of the dead may relate to factors such as age at death and circumstances of death, resulting in several concurrent norms for funerary practice, as one commentator was saying in the discussion yesterday. I think this is exactly right. Understanding relationships between personhood and death requires exploration of a whole range of material media, including those found in funerary deposits and those which may have been kept among the living. And this includes human remains, but it also includes personal objects. Where relevant, it can include names, images. Treatment of the corpse is one part of a complex, holistic field of relations in which life and death is understood, often in terms of the key technologies of daily life, such as agricultural cycles of decay and regrowth, or the movement of substances between different vessels. That can be bodies, it can be pots, it can be tombs. There's a lot more that could be said about the role of metaphors. They deserve more attention than I've been able to give them in the discussion today. But overall, a comparative approach can highlight both commonalities and how personhood is transformed through interactions between the living and the dead, and also draw out the distinctiveness of how this process operates in any given community. Thank you for listening.